Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Mason. I'm Vice President of Litigation at Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And today it's my extreme pleasure to welcome back Dr. Peter Gray. Dr. Gray is a prominent psychologist. He's written a very influential book called Free to Learn. We talked about that last time we had a conversation. And he has written extensively about such important things as play, which last time we spoke, he told me there's actually a journal, a peer-reviewed journal of play. And I said, no, that can't be true. But actually there is. Peter is a very interesting guest. He's the founder or co-founder of Alliance for Self-Directed Learning and Let Grow, both of which contribute to our conversation today. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, it's very, very nice to be here.
So, Peter, today I wanted to talk to you about the work you've been doing since the pandemic has forced public schools to close. Tell us about how you came about doing that work and what was your, how did you do it? What did you do?
Yeah, so this was a study sponsored by the Let Grow nonprofit organization. I wasn't the one primarily involved in designing the study. It was actually designed primarily by Lenore Skenazy, who's the president of Let Grow, and Tracy Tomaso, who was at that time the executive director of Let Grow. They conceived of the study as market research. They wanted to get information that would be useful to Let Grow in carrying out its mission of working with families, helping families, and particularly its mission of helping families find ways to give their children more freedom than most children have in our culture today. Lenore Skenazy is the author of the book Free Range Kids, and out of that book came her conception of Let Grow. Let's figure out ways to give children more freedom. And of course, it was a very attractive idea to me. I had been writing about the same thing. We got to know one another, and I was one of the co-founders with her of Let Grow. So although I wasn't primarily the designer of the study, I did contribute to some degree in the questions. Now, once the study was done, the results seemed so interesting to me that I felt it ought to be disseminated more widely. And so I got permission from the Let Grow team to do a further analysis of it and prepare an academic article, which is now in press in the American Journal of Play. You mentioned that there's a Journal of Play. Yes, indeed. I've published quite a number of articles there. So let me tell you about the study. So it involved two nationwide surveys, actually a total of 4 nationwide surveys. 2 of them in April of 2020, about a month after schools closed, a little more than a month after schools closed. This was in mid-April. And the second 2 surveys in mid-May, about 2 months after schools had closed. And so each of those months, one survey was sent out to 800 families, where the survey was, and all of the families had children in the age range of 8 to 13. So one of the surveys was addressed to children. We sent it out to be filled out by the children in those families. To another 800 families, we sent it out to be filled out by the parents. Again, in both cases, these are families that had children between 8 and 13. And and so we did this twice. We did this in April and in May. Now, among the questions we asked were questions about the mood of the child, how the child was faring psychologically during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic, what the child was doing, what the relationship was like between the parents and children. And we asked these kinds of questions both of the children and the parents. We also asked the parents how they were doing in the survey to them. So there are really quite a number of questions, and I'm not going to go through them all, but the primary finding of interest are the following. First, the children psychologically, all in all, were doing better after schools closed and all those after school activities closed than they were before. One of the items, for example, we asked the children, are you more calm or less calm now than you were before? And twice as many said more calm as said less calm. We asked a similar question to the parents. Is your child more stressed or less stressed than before the school closures? And many more said less stressed than said more stressed. We asked questions we asked parents to check off, and children in a different way, to check off what the child's mood was over the past week. The primary happiness was at the top of the list. Sad was at the bottom of the list. It truly was. I mean, here we've been reading all these predictions. If you've been reading the papers, you know, everybody, all those clinical psychologists, all these people were predicting that this is going to be disastrous for the children's mental health, having this school disrupted, having their schedules disrupted, being stuck at home. We did not find that. I don't want to say that it wasn't disastrous for some people. I can't say it. We don't know from this study. And I'm sure that there are some families that have suffered as a result of it. But this cross-section, socioeconomically, racially, geographically, the children were doing better. So that was one set of questions. We asked an open-ended question. We asked a number of open-ended questions of the children. One of them was whether they missed school, and if so, what they missed about it. Now, it turned out that most of the children did say they did miss school, but when they said what they missed about it, you'll not be surprised that essentially the only response that we got from that, something like 85% said friends. They miss seeing their friends. Seeing their friends is very, very important, and they were being deprived of seeing their friends during the pandemic. So even though school may have been a source of stress in some ways, it seemed to them worth it to go back so they could see their friends. One of the questions we asked that I think resulted in some of the most interesting responses, an open-ended question, was what do you like best about this period? Okay, so this period when you're home. And this was actually, I have to say, a surprise to me. By far and away, what they responded that they liked best was having so much time with their family. Eating dinners with their family. Families that had not been eating dinners together, now we're finding time to eat dinners together. Playing games with their parents. Getting to know their parents getting to know them. Isn't that interesting? I mean, kids have been so carted around between going to school and doing homework at home and then going to after-school activities. There hasn't been a lot of time for parents and children to really get to know it. And parents have been so busy too. So suddenly things were slowed down, not just for the kids, but even for many of the parents, things were slowed down. The parents were home, working at home. That commute was cut out of their day, so that gave them some extra time. The kids, even if they were doing school at home, it was distance learning was only taking them, we also asked this question, was only taking them an average of 3 hours to do all the schoolwork. And so they had a lot, so suddenly here are their families, they had a lot of time. You know, a lot of people think that, oh gosh, if family members are stuck together at home, this is going to be a disaster. You know, they'll be tearing one another apart. But that isn't what we found in this study. Another question that we asked of parents, which in some ways even surprised me, was the answer even surprised me, was have conflicts between you and your child increased or decreased? Many more said that conflicts decreased. Imagine that. So here the children are home all day, the parents are home all day. In the past, they only spent a certain amount of time together at home. You would think conflicts would increase. They'd be getting into one another's hair, they'd be bothering one another. But conflicts decreased. Well, here's how I make sense of that. We didn't ask why conflicts decreased, but to me, in retrospect, it doesn't seem that surprising, because what are the conflicts between children and parents? A lot of those conflicts center around school, getting the kids up in the morning to get off to school, making sure they do the assigned homework, getting them off to all those extracurricular activities that they were in, carting them around. These are conflict creating situations where you're kind of fighting your child to keep your child on schedule. Now, suddenly that schedule was thrown out the window, and there wasn't that much to be conflictual about. The other thing that parents responded, both in an open-ended question and in a kind of checkoff lists, is that the children, they were pleased to discover that they didn't really have to amuse their children all day. Their children could figure out things to do. Their children found interesting things to do. The children found, and that was one of the questions we asked, both in an open-ended question and also in kind of a checklist form. Some of the things we asked the children to indicate some of the things they're doing, and some of them are learning how to play a musical instrument for the first time. Some of them were learning how to ride a bicycle. Never had time to learn how to ride a bicycle before. This is something they could do, socially distancing outdoors. So a lot of them were reading what they wanted to read instead of assigned reading. And here is one of the most remarkable things. Quite a large number of them were learning how to cook. They'd never really had time to cook, or their parents never trusted them to cook, or the parents didn't have time to show them how to cook. There were a lot of kids want to know how to cook. This seems like an interesting and fun thing to do. And many of the kids expressed a lot of pride about the fact that they were sometimes cooking the meal for the whole family. Wow. What parent wouldn't want that, right? And the kids are feeling so good about it. So one of the questions we ask of the parents is, among the various checklist things, is whether to check off if they see their children as being more grown up than before, and the result was yes. I mean, this fits, of course, with the let grow view, that give children more freedom and autonomy, give them opportunity to express themselves, to find their interests, and that helps them grow. So those were some of the findings. The part of the study that showed that, where we asked them what they found best, it was the second thing after this family togetherness. The second highest rating was that they had time to do things that they wanted to do. So time with the family, getting to know the family, time to do what I want to do, as opposed to what other people are either making me do or pushing me to do.
So, Peter, coming from a homeschooling organization, I'm a homeschooling dad, chose homeschooling many years ago. You are closely affiliated with self-directed learning and the Let Grow philosophy. Would you say that what you learned is, we chatted earlier in the green room, it seems that what you learned from the study is both intuitive at a very deep kind of human way, but it's also counterintuitive in that it kind of runs against the narrative of what people were saying was likely to happen during the pandemic. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, let me talk about the counterintuitive part, or what counters. So we've all been reading about how all these predictions about the dire consequences for children's mental health of being stuck at home. And many people began to believe that this came out of research studies, that somehow the people who were saying this knew because they had actually done research studies. But at the time that these predictions were being made, there were no research studies. So people were saying this based on, based on supposedly their clinical expertise or their hunches, but these were people with fancy titles, and doctor this or that after their name. And so the journalists took them seriously and reported it as if this were fact rather than just someone's opinion. I've got it right in front of me because I figured you'd be asking some of these similar questions. And the article that I wrote the manuscript of the article I wrote for the American Journal of Play. And I just want to read a quote from somebody that was presented about the same time and that I think is just actually worth reading. This is a clinical psychologist who says, who's warning people, let's not just focus on the negative effects. Maybe there are some positive effects. And what he said is, he and his colleagues said, this was a number of them, the lockdown-induced changes in daily routine seems to actually reduce child and adolescent mental illness symptoms and even improve well-being based on our clinical observations. So here's somebody with some standing who's saying, and he goes on to warn researchers, if you're only looking for the negative, that's what you'll find. But do your research in such a way that you're also inviting people to talk about the positive effects. Well, it's interesting. This wasn't available for me to read at the time we designed the Let Grow study, but that's exactly what we did. We designed the study to look at all kinds of, we invited people to talk about both the negative and positive consequences of this lockdown. It turns out that by now there are a number of published surveys that have been done. And ours is not the only survey that showed beneficial effects. There was a survey in the UK that showed a reduction in anxiety as a result of the pandemic among teenagers. There was a survey in the United States by the Wheatley Family Institute in which the researchers reported that, to their surprise, depression had declined as a result over what they had measured among the same population prior to the pandemic. They also found, by the way, and this was part of their explanation of why depression may have declined, that the adolescents that were surveyed there talked about the value of connections to their family, that they were eating dinners together, that they were, to the surprise of those researchers, loneliness declined, even though the kids said they were missing their friends. And so what they suggested, well, loneliness declined because they're connecting with their family and their parents, and feeling secure as a result of it. There was another study, a study in Norway, where they asked. This was a survey of kids of school age, and what they found was that the children reported themselves to be less angry, less anxious, happier than they had been before. Now, this is, in some ways, we think of these as studies of the effects of the pandemic, which seems odd. A pandemic creating improved mental health, improved family relationships, and so on and so forth. But I think of it not so much as a study of the effect of the pandemic, but a study of the effect of what was going on before the pandemic. People talk about the pandemic experience as the abnormal situation and talk about going back to normal. But was what we had before the pandemic normal in any human sense? Normal in the sense of that was what was happening to most people. But is it normal in the sense of it being a kind of a healthy situation? And I had long been writing about the fact that it's not. that over time, over the decades really of my own life, we have created a world that is increasingly stressful for children. More and more time in school, less and less options of what you're doing in school, less creative activity in school, and more just drilling for tests. More pressure to get high grades, get into all those honors classes, and so on and so forth. And out of school, we've deprived children of the freedom to just go out and play. You know, they're out of school, they're still spending time doing homework. They are often being carted around to extracurricular activities, in part because the parents believe this is going to help them get into a fancy college if they do that, whereas just play doesn't count on a resume, right? So I've been arguing for a long time that in many ways we have taken childhood away from children. Childhood should be and always was, you know, except in times of childhood slavery or round-the-clock child labor. Childhood is always been understood as a time when you've got a lot of free time to get bored, time to figure things out for yourself, time to get into trouble and figure out how to get out of trouble, time to make friends, time to try out lots of different things and see what you like to do. That's what childhood is supposed to be. That children are designed for that kind of a life. That's how they grow up. To learn how to take charge of themselves, solve their own problems, make friends on their own through their own efforts. We have long been depriving children of that. Now suddenly, we don't put them into the ideal childhood situation by any means, because they're not free to just go out and play with their friends. But we've suddenly given them time. And time to get bored. One of the things that one of the items on the checklist was, are you feeling bored? And yeah, something like 60% at the beginning of the pandemic were feeling bored. Interestingly, boredom went down somewhat by the time we did the second survey. And I think what happens, boredom, we think of boredom as a bad thing. Oh, a child is bored, we're supposed to try to amuse the child in some way so they get over the boredom. But if we can refrain from doing that, boredom is what stirs children and anybody else to take initiative, to figure out, well, what do I really want to do? What can I do to overcome my boredom? And boredom is a healthy feeling in that sense. It stirs the soul. It gets you going. And so children had not really had time to get bored before, and now suddenly they do, and they respond to that by finding all these interesting things to do, like cooking meals and riding bicycle and playing in a positive way with their younger brothers and sisters.
Well, that's an interesting perspective that I hadn't really thought of it in quite those same terms. The pandemic created the environment in which to study how life had been pre-pandemic, in a way. And
in a certain sense, that's right. Not quite fully, because of the fact that you're confined at home, largely confined at home.
So the pandemic, sort of the pre-pandemic world that had evolved during our lifetimes of extreme, scheduling, and I think Lenore talks about helicopter parenting and children not being able to just run out into the neighborhood, and those kinds of things had accreted over time, and suddenly much of that was just stripped away. And so you could survey what stripping that away, what effect that had on children and parents and family life. So what do you think about going forward? What does this teach us, and how can, is it a positive side effect that can be sustained, or is it something that people are going to go back to?
That's a really good question. I tend to be fairly optimistic in my outlook, and I think that many families are not going to go back to what they had before. I can't predict exactly how many. We know that one of the consequences of the pandemic was that there's been and you probably know this better than I do, there's been a spike in homeschooling. So, and this is not virtual schooling at home, but this is people who have actually taken their kids out of school and initiated homeschooling. Now, I'm sure that many of those people, and in fact, according to a Gallup poll, homeschooling doubled from August of 2019 to 2020, and that doubling, so it went from 10% by the Gallup poll, 10% of families homeschooling, up to from 5% up to 10%. Huge increase in homeschooling. Now, I'm sure that a good number, probably most of those additional homeschoolers were seeing it as a temporary change to get out of the distance learning that wasn't working well, to protect their children from COVID if the school was reopening at a time when COVID is still around and is still a danger. So they chose homeschooling, and they also found that by homeschooling, they could do things more in accordance with the family schedule instead of doing things in accordance with the online school schedule, and especially in situations where the school wanted the parents to be involved and the parents couldn't be involved at those times. So I think that was part of it. But I think a lot of those people who've gone to homeschooling, I can't say how many, are going to stick with it. I hear from quite a few people. I hear from families who say, I don't think we're going to go back to school. This is working out pretty well. I think that people who may not even have thought of homeschooling, or maybe did kind of think of it, but really weren't ready to take the leap, this pushed them to take the leap. And now that they've tried it out, I think a lot of families are finding that, hey, we can do this. And my kids seem to be learning. They seem to be happy in this situation, and so there may not be any reason for us to go back to school once it seems safe to go back to school. So that's happening. I also work in various ways with school systems, and some of the school systems are talking about the fact that, what are the children going to need when they come back? And I think that now there's sort of two sides to this story, and I'm probably hearing to some degree the side that I want to hear. The side that I don't want to hear is, oh, we've got to double down on the academic learning because they're all a year behind, right? I mean, that's the worst thing that could happen. But I hear a lot of superintendents and principals saying that's not what we need to do. What we need to do is we need to be a welcoming place at school. And part of being a welcoming place is a place where kids play, where kids feel comfortable. So some of the things that Let Grow, the organization, Lenore Skenazy's organization, does with schools, there are people talking about, we want to start doing these kinds of things. We want to have what's called play club in the school, an hour of free play, age-mixed free play, at least once a week. We want to do some of the other Let Grow exercises where kids have actually assignments to do something interesting and somewhat scary outside of school, and to negotiate with their parents about doing it. And we want to do these kinds of things that are other than just the strict, they don't say this word, but boring routine of studying for tests that we've been doing all along. So I'm hoping some of that will happen. I'm right now talking with people in a number of school districts who are talking about that. It's a little too early for them to make definite plans. It's not even clear what's going to happen in the fall semester at schools. It's not clear whether they're even going to be able to have recess because the COVID threat may still be around, let alone play club and some of these other things. But I do think that there are changes going forward. I'm sure that there will be more homeschoolers after all this settles down than they were before the pandemic. And I kind of believe in the tipping point theory of social change. That the way social change occurs is a certain number of sort of pioneering, venturous people take a step that runs counter to what the rest of the culture is doing. They do it, and then some other people say this seems to be working out pretty well for them, And the old way hasn't been working out so well for us and our kids. Let's try it. They're doing it, you know. And so then there are that group of people who are doing it. And the more people who do it, the more normal it seems, the less abnormal, the less weird it seems. So we've all already reached the point where homeschooling doesn't seem so weird anymore to people. Almost everybody knows somebody who's homeschooling, right? And it's not such a crazy thing as it was many, many years ago. And so I think that you reach a certain point. Maybe, you know, some theorists say it's around 15%, some say it's 10%, 15%, who knows what it is. When enough people are doing it, that it becomes really an accepted, normal, alternative way to do things. And then people make the judgment based on what's going to work best for us, based on real data. And I think when people are making that judgment that way and not being defensive and afraid I'm doing something abnormal, people are going to think I'm ruining my child and so on and so forth if I do this, I think there will be a very big shift. And when that occurs, I think either the schools are going to have to change radically, or they're ultimately going to become obsolete.
One of the main things that we've done here at Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and before I continue with that thought, anybody who's listening, if you have questions for Peter Gray, go ahead and put them in the comments now, and I'll be glad to relay them on to him. But one of the things that we started doing early on, about the same time as you were doing your surveys, was in recognition of the fact that this was very disruptive to a lot of people through no fault of their own and not even a choice of theirs. And so we devoted a lot of our resources to communicating to people about how they could, giving them resources to sort of weather this storm in the early days. And one of our big goals was not just providing them with resources to be able to, teach their kids at home during this time, but we also wanted to communicate to people that this could be a joyous thing for them and their family. It wasn't of their choosing. It wasn't something that, they spent a lot of time thinking about and finally did. They were kind of thrust into it. And we hear those kind of stories all the time. I met with a guy, sort of a counterpart at another large nonprofit organization, young man, with young kids, and he just volunteered. We weren't homeschooling before at all, and we weren't really all that happy to get thrust into it, but we're not going back because they discovered how much fun it was to be there in the room when their kids learned new things, how just being with their kids more. And I mean, your survey really backs that up, that both children and parents actually, highlight as the most important thing at this time, that they spent more quality time together.
I think that's right. Yeah, there's two other studies that I came across and reviewed in the process of writing the article on our study that emphasized what parents can do. One of the studies looked at one of the studies that was looking at the psychological effects of the pandemic also was asking the parents questions about what they were doing at home. And what they found out in that study was that those parents who maintained a sort of regular family routine, eating meals together was one of the things, some kind of a bedtime ritual. These were with young kids. These were with preschool kids, some kind of reading a story to your child, that the kids fared far better in families that did that kind of thing than in families that had kind of variable day-to-day and unpredictable sort of home life schedule for the kids. So in some sense, that's common sense, but we don't always think about that. So the other one, which fits very much with my own philosophy and that of Let Grow, was a study that looked at different parenting styles with their kids and tracked how the parent was interacting with their kids over time in a diary study where the parents reported daily on various aspects of what they were doing, what their kids were doing, how their kids were feeling, what they were feeling. The primary result of that was that those parents who supported the child's autonomy, supported the child in allowing the child to choose what the child wanted to do, that didn't give in to the idea that I need to be interacting with my child all day long, but basically said, this is time for you to do what you want to do, and encourage the child to do what they wanted to do. That in that case, both the children did better over time, over the 3-week period of this diary study, and the parents did better over time, because by supporting the child's own autonomy and independence, that gave the parents more time to do the work and relaxation that they needed to do to fulfill their own needs. So parents that kind of believe that because my children are home all day, that means I am stuck all day long, I can't do anything else but take care of them in some sense, that just resulted in a worsening of situation over time, both for the parent and the child. The idea that the understanding that my child, even if my child doesn't believe it at the beginning, is capable of figuring out what to do, that had a much better trajectory over the 3-week period for both child and parent.
Well, that's an interesting sort of conundrum, because in one breath you're saying that families that have sort of a structure that includes these, key moment rituals, that's a good thing, and children like that. But part of the structure of the day needs to be encouraging the children to pursue their own interests and be autonomous as a purposeful kind of thing.
Right. I think there's a certain sense in which those two things are complementary. So you've got certain family time, you eat your dinner together, you have a bedtime ritual together, but the rest of the day you're not necessarily depending upon one another. You've got your own life to live. Even if you're in the same family, you've got your own life to live. And you're acknowledging that the child has a life to live, that I, the parent, need to respect that child's opportunity and even encourage the child to determine their own life a good share of the time. And similarly, the child has to learn to respect the parent's right, that the parent is not there just to take care of the child. The parent has other obligations, especially in our world today, of employment and so on. And the parent has a need to pursue their own activities that don't always involve the child.
It's one of the things that we homeschool advocates kind of preach all the time, and I know talking to you I'll be preaching to the choir, but one of the great things about homeschooling is not just letting the children pursue their own interests and have that autonomous time to learn to be who they're meant to be, but it also gives you the freedom to develop the kind of education that you want for the child based on the child's aptitudes, learning challenges, interests, and do that child by child, as opposed to the sort of factory-based model of school where you send all 6-year-olds to the same room to do the same thing hour after hour, day after day, and then expect them all to kind of respond exactly the same and advance at the same pace. It just seems like this last year has kind of exposed a lot more people to that kind of thinking through just, they had no choice. They had to see that's how children are. We're actually, we all like to be thought of as individuals, but the kind of American system of education doesn't really treat kids as individuals.
Yeah, and it really can't. You've got 25 or 30 kids in the class. You can't. You've got one teacher. You can't You can't get to know them all. You can't. They're all stuck in one room. They're all these people you've got, and then even if you didn't have the requirement from the top down that everybody's got to pass the same tests at the same time in the same way, even if you didn't have that, how could you manage in that situation? The kinds of schools that I'm involved with for self-directed education, they don't look anything like that kind of a classroom. You don't have kids all stuck in the classroom. They can run wherever they want. They can go wherever they want. They're free to go outdoors whenever they want. They interact with whomever they want. They play with whatever they want. They learn whatever they want at various times of day. That works, and that's individualized by the child themselves. But if you've got this typical schools where you're stuck in that little room with all these other people, imagine trying to engage every single one of these around their own interests and predilections and take into account everybody's different personality. Absolutely not possible. So I think that what happens is, and I think that some parents came to this realization, so here you are, you're during the pandemic, you're home with your kid is supposed to be doing this distance learning online. And so the school curriculum, the typical school curriculum, is now being presented online, and the parents are supposed to be there, at least with the younger kids, helping them out. So the parents, in many cases for the first time, are seeing what those lessons are like. And they're saying, oh, I'm bored to tears here, and no wonder my kid doesn't want to do this or is kind of bored about it. And they're starting to ask questions like, so the school wants them to read this, but my child wants to read that. And is there any particular reason that I can imagine that this is more educationally valuable than that? And as soon as you start thinking that way, you begin to realize, well, something, I, as the parent, might actually be better qualified to help my child find a curriculum than that teacher would be. It's not because I'm smarter or anything like that. It's just because I've only got one child, or if I've got 5 kids, I've got 5 children to think about instead of 30, and I've got a whole house, and I don't have to make sure that everybody does everything at the same time, and I can allow people to sleep late in the morning if that's what they want to do, so they're more well rested for the lesson. As soon as you begin thinking that way, you begin thinking, so many parents, I think, well, I don't have a degree in education. What do I know about being a teacher? But I think as soon as you kind of watch teaching going on, you realize, well, at least in terms of with my own kid, I could do better than that. In some ways, I'm surprised that more people don't come to that conclusion. I think it's just that we're such a world that really for some reason believes, and I shouldn't even say for some reason, it's clear why. It's because of historical reasons. Over time, I'm assuming you went to school, I went to school, my parents went to school, my grandparents went to school. We're a 3rd or 4th generation schooled. We can hardly imagine what it's like to grow up without school. We just think that's normal. And so you need something to shake you out of that in order to begin to realize that's not really necessary. There are easier, more enjoyable, less time-consuming ways to do this.
So we've done some surveying since the pandemic began as well, and we kind of focused on people who became associated with our organization since the beginning of the year. And the people who joined us after the start of the pandemic, when the school disruption occurred, kind of consistently addressed as one of their main concerns about continuing to homeschool once they've tasted it is, how are their kids going to get on in life if they're homeschooled their whole life? Now, you have taken, the self-directed learning, which I think we used to call unschooling approach, and you support organizations that pursue that. How do kids that are not in this kind of, common core 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, 200 days out of the year, or whatever it is now. How do they get on in life? Can you address those concerns to people who may be, worried about that?
Yes, definitely. In fact, this was when I first got interested in self-directed education. This was my first question. This was many, many years ago, and my own son was going to a school for self-directed education, Sudbury Valley School. No curriculum, no tests, none of what we usually think of as school, following his own interests, playing and exploring, along with all the other kids in the school in this age-mixed environment. He was really happy. I could see he was learning a lot of interesting things. There was no question about it. I could see the other kids were happy and were learning interesting things, but I really wondered what's going to happen to them when they grow up? Do they all end up becoming starving artists, or do they, living in their parents' basements? So I don't want that. I love my kid, but so I actually ended up doing a study of the graduates of that school, and then later on I did a study of grown unschoolers, home-based unschoolers, people who are doing homeschooling, but with the method commonly called unschooling, where there is no imposed curriculum. There are no tests, where in fact the children follow their own interests and the parents support them in following their own interests, help them find what they need to look for, help connect them to the larger world, and so on and so forth, but don't require them to study any particular things or test them. So in both of those studies of people who grew up without what we usually think of as school, I found that as grown-ups, they were doing very well in life. Those who wanted to go on to higher education, and this was the biggest surprise to me, had no particular problem doing it. Here, we think that you've got to take you not only have to get your high school diploma at a regular school, but you've got to take all these particular courses or you'll never get into college. Or many people believe you've got to get into the honors courses. You've got to get into this and that. You've got to do all of these things, and kids are so pressured about it. Well, here I was studying people who had done none of that, none of it. In some cases, they had never been to a regular school. They had grown up this way, just following their own interests. Some of them had never taken a test until they took the SAT test, because if they wanted to go to a sort of elite college and it required the SAT test, in which case they studied for it and they did fine. So here were people getting into college who had no typical high school diploma, had not taken all these kinds of courses, going on, getting in, and not only getting in, but doing fine, and in many cases excelling once they were there. In my study, both of the graduates of Sudbury Valley and the grown unschoolers, they thought they had overall an advantage over other kids because they were used to taking charge of their own lives. Whereas a lot of the others, when they went off to college for the first time in their life, they didn't have somebody looking over them and telling them moment to moment what to do. And so what happens? You do a lot of drinking. You forget about doing the stuff you're supposed to do at college. And all of this kind of but these kids were used to taking control of themselves, and if they went to college because they had a good reason to, not because they felt that they had to do it. I mean, after all, they had learned what they wanted to know on their own, and so they were going either because they were oriented towards a career that more or less requires college, and so they wanted to do it. It was their own choice to do it. They wanted to do it well. Or because for one reason or another, they really wanted a liberal arts education offered to them in this kind of way. They thought, oh, this would be really cool, hearing from all these experts and not having to dig out the information myself. So that's so this was eye-opening to me. And the more I thought about it afterwards, the less surprising it became, for a number of reasons. One that I already said is that these young people are learning to take responsibility. So if there's something they need to learn to catch up, they just do it. And I think what we all know, if we think about our own experience, you can learn anything you want. if you really want to learn it. And you can learn it quickly if you really want to learn it. The stuff that takes years, if you're doing it by force in school, you can learn very quickly if you're doing it on your own initiative. And that's true whether you're a kid or whether you're an adult. The motivation, the desire to learn it, whether you are desiring to learn it because you're just flat out curious about it, or because this is something I really need to know now to go on with the next steps in life. There's no comparison between how brilliant a learner you are in that situation compared to when somebody is browbeating you to make you study this stuff so you can pass a test that is not an interesting adventure to you. So that's one thing. The other thing I recognize, and I taught in college for 30 years. I'm retired now from teaching, but I could never assume that high school students remembered anything from high school. You just can't assume that. And I think we all know that. I mean, how much of what you learned in high school do you remember? And one of the ways I kind of pose this to parents sometimes is, so do you remember studying quadratic equations? In high school? Everybody raises their hand. So is there anybody here who can tell me what a quadratic equation is? Or have you ever met a quadratic equation in real life? Or, I've asked this even of scientists, and I have yet to find somebody who's actually met a quadratic equation in real life. I'm sure that there are some people who do use quadratic equations, some tiny, small portion of people. And yet somehow we believe everybody's got to study this or you'll never get into college, right? Along with all these other things, which everybody forgets. And so even, so a typical student in our survey was somebody who was studying biology in college, wanted to become a doctor, and so needed to take biology courses and biochemistry and stuff like that. And so I asked, so here you are, you're in this biology course, you're in a chemistry course, all these other kids studied this stuff in college and you haven't. Doesn't this give you a big disadvantage? And what this person said is, well, it is some disadvantage. It means that I have to look some stuff up now and then. But it turns out that most of the other kids don't know this stuff either. But at least because I know I don't know it, I look it up. So this is me talking now. But imagine that the professor has used the word meiosis in talking about cell division, and you've never heard that word before because you never took biology, and maybe the other kids kind of vaguely remember hearing that word, but they don't know what it means either. But today you take this thing out of your pocket. You don't even have to type it in anymore. You just say, Siri, what's meiosis? You say it quietly enough so that it doesn't disturb the class. And there you've got your answer. I mean, we live in a world where you don't have to carry a lot of information around in your head. We were never very good at carrying a lot of information around in our head. I mean, maybe the Greeks and Romans were long ago, or even before them, before people wrote stuff down. But we're acting as if our schools are acting as if it's necessary to have a lot of stuff in our heads. And even that's not working, because what happens is people become very good at stuffing stuff into their heads long enough to pass the test, and then flushing it all out so they can restuff for the next test. What a waste of time.
Well, kind of to recap, sort of summarize what you've been saying, and you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears to me that this period of disruption in many fronts, the disruption of the traditional school, the disruption in the workplace, and many other things, has taught us kind of new lessons. And maybe some of those lessons are that our pre-existing expectations that we placed on ourselves and on our children may have been flawed. And this time of reflecting and having to respond and having no choice to respond kind of has stripped away some of those false expectations in ways that can maybe rejuvenate the way we approach education in America.
I certainly hope so. I really certainly hope so. I mean, I think I may have talked about this when we talked before, but the the situation for children, for the typical school-age children, is disastrous right now. The rates of anxiety, the rates of depression, huge numbers of kids are suffering from anxiety and depression. The rate of childhood suicide. I mean, I can't overemphasize this. As a society, we put our heads in the sand about all this. We want to pretend that school is only a good thing. But there are data that never get into the popular press, as far as I can see. But the data are out there showing that school is a major cause, if not the major cause, of psychological disorders in children today. One of the bits of evidence for this is that when the American Psychological Association did a study of anxiety in America, they found that teenagers in school were the most anxious people in America. And they found that the rates of anxiety were twice as high when they did this survey in the school year than when they did it in the summer, when kids were off from school. Moreover, when they asked kids about the source of their anxiety, something like 85% said school. We don't hear about that. We hear everybody wants to find some other reason for the source of anxiety. They want to say it's due to social media or all these video games or bullying from other kids or bad parenting or, every possible reason for it other than what the kids are telling us when we ask them. The rate of suicide, I said suicides have been continuing to go up as schools become more onerous and as children have had less opportunity to just play and be themselves. The rate of suicide as well as suicide attempts is twice as high during the school year as away from the school year. That kind of data was one reason why I was not so surprised that shutting down school for the pandemic relieved children of anxiety and depression. It didn't fully relieve it because there are reasons to continue being anxious and depressed. Obviously, during a pandemic, you're cut off from friends. You're also trying to do school online, which is itself anxiety provoking in its own ways. But in some sense, it was like a vacation from school. And what we know is vacation from school improves mental health of children.
Well, Peter, once again, thanks for joining me today. Last word to you about your survey, your study, and I just want to say, before you give the last word, I am jealous because the American Journal of Play won't publish anything by me. I don't get to write for such a thing. Anyway, last word to you.
Well, have you tried? Maybe you could.
Maybe I should, yeah. So
should.
I was actually that kid who was constantly learning how to get out of trouble.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's part of growing up. If we're depriving our children the opportunity to get into trouble, we're depriving them the opportunity to learn how to get out of trouble.
Yeah.
Getting out of trouble is one of the greatest skills in life. So I don't know that I have any final word except to say to really everybody, trust your children. I say that all the time, trust your kids. Listen to your kids, trust your kids. It's a self-fulfilling event. If kids are trusted, they become trustworthy.
Well, thank you, Peter. Once again, fascinating discussion. And so if your family is thinking about homeschooling, we at HSLDA have a lot of free resources to help you get started. And I would say also that many of our resources are designed to help you not just be successful, but to actually be joyful in experiencing your children through this great adventure that we call homeschooling. You can check that out at hslda.org. And if you're already homeschooling but not a member of HSLDA, we'd love to have you join us at hslda.org/join. So thanks again to our guest, Dr. Peter Gray. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.